We are coming on the air tonight, and you just saw it. President Biden resetting, rebooting, recalibrating, whatever you want to call it, for year 2 of his presidency, making a ton of headlines in that news conference just now. His legislative agenda, COVID, the economy, foreign policy, saying he did not overpromise and laying out some of the ways he's looking at 2022 differently than 2021. And as this is all going down, you saw it just there right now, this kind of split screen moment in Washington, setting up the drama or maybe the lack of it with the vote coming up tonight on a voting rights package the president wants, a vote that basically looks dead given GOP opposition and some Democratic division. The president explaining how he wants to get some pieces of his Build Back Better plan done, pieces, not the whole thing. And why is that important? It's critical for you if you want, for example, help with childcare, help paying for college, more help getting masks, getting tests from the administration. I'm Hallie, and we're going to talk about all of it because President Biden just did in that marathon news conference, hitting on his agenda, hitting on inflation. I know you care about that. On COVID, same thing. On Ukraine, let's hit the highlights.
Is there anything that you are confident you can get signed into law before the midterm elections?
Yes, I'm confident we can get pieces, big chunks of the Build Back Better law signed into law. Should we have done more testing earlier? Yes, but we're doing more now. We've gone from 0 at-home tests a year ago to 375 million tests on the market in just this month. Now we need to get inflation under control. Given the strength of our economy and the pace of recent price increases, it's appropriate, as the federal chairman, Chairman Powell, the Fed Chairman Powell has indicated, to recalibrate the support that is now necessary. Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera. But if they actually do what they're capable of doing with the force amassed on the border, it is going to be a disaster for Russia if they further invade Ukraine, and that our allies and partners are ready to impose severe cost and significant harm on Russia and the Russian economy.
Again, the president talking about a whole lot of things in the face of a mixed bag on the economy right now, confusing COVID messages coming from the administration, looking back at year 1, a year in which he signed that $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill into law, a year in which more people got jobs and the unemployment rate went down, a year in which 210 million of us are now fully vaccinated. And he laid out what he's going to change up next year. He's going to get out of D.C. more. He's going to look for more advice from outside experts. He's going to focus on helping Democrats in the midterms. But listen, you know the backdrop, right? The pandemic is not over. Far from it. Inflation is higher than it's been in a generation. The president's social spending plan is going to get broken up, and voting rights legislation is hitting a dead end in Congress as we speak. I want to bring in Chuck Todd and Carol Lee, who are joining me now. Carol, I'll start with you at the White House, because I think I think for the vast majority of people watching, right, people care really about 2 things, their money and their health. Other things matter, but I think those 2 things are critical to so many families around the country. And the president is trying to speak directly to those Americans, right? When it comes to issues related to the economy and inflation, he was pressed a lot about that. Same deal when it came to the pandemic, Carol.
Exactly, Hallie. And I think what you saw was the president really trying to reposition himself in year 2. So what you heard at the beginning of year 1 was big, ambitious, reach for the sky type of things that he wanted to do. And now you saw a president who was far more practical about what he can actually get done, and saying that he would break up, as you mentioned, the Build Back Better bill, and conceding basically that the child tax credit is not going to be in there, along with the community college provision. And then he also said that he could get chunks of his voting rights bill and kick the door open to doing this Electoral Reform Act. So he's talking more in piecemeal things, trying to get things done, saying that he'll talk to Republicans about some of those things. And really what was hanging over all of this, though, at the same time, he really zeroed in on COVID and said that, look, we're not through it, but we will get through it. And I have a plan, and I'm going to execute it, and try to acknowledge that, that this is something that is still bothering people in their everyday lives, and he's trying to do something about it, as well as inflation. You heard him, he talked about the Fed. So he's really trying to sort of consolidate what he's focusing on, and that is the economy and COVID, and trying to be far more practical and smaller in terms of the vision to actually get things done.
Carol, you said something important there that, Chuck, I know was something that you were listening for. And I want to kind of stay in the realm of like the money health buckets for a second, which was he acknowledged people's frustration. I know that is something, based on our conversations earlier today, that you were wondering if he would do. What would the tone be? Would he give that sort of empathetic, I get that this is hard, I get that you're exhausted, here's what I'm doing? And listen, we heard him pretty directly take on this criticism that these masks, hundreds of millions of them, right, that the administration will send to people for free. These tests you're going to get for free. They may not be coming at the time that everybody wanted them to be coming, right, which would have been a month ago, but at least they're coming at all.
Right. You know, for a guy who said he didn't believe the polls at one point in that press conference, which made me smirk, he struck me as a guy who is reading the polls, who did see some focus groups, and gets it, that he's lost a bunch of support from the vast middle of the electorate. And I say vast middle, I basically mean not the partisan-driven or the ideologically driven people, but the ones who what they ask for, you know, they may lean more left or lean more right, but they're just looking for, hey, fix X, or can't you do this? And so in that sense, I agree with Carol, by the way. I mean, he for the first time in a long time, he sounded like the candidate who ran for president. Hey, you know, again, he said a couple of times, he reminded people he was a capitalist. Yeah. So
he said, I'm not Bernie Sanders, as you know.
Say he's gone too. That's right. He is right. I'm not taking us further to the left. Let me tell you who is further to the left, right? That's Bernie Sanders. So, look, he did come across to me as somebody who is seeing what the public is saying, hearing people. And I'll tell you this, look, as a reporter, all I want to know is I want to hear what you're thinking, why you're thinking that, what's your rationale. And it struck me today, and then we could sit here and nitpick, okay, he's not the most, you know, nimble answer of questions. But I have a better sense of what he's thinking now. And he talked about it himself. He doesn't communicate enough to the public. He says African-American voters might not believe it's his sincerity because he hasn't been able to look them in the eye. Congressional Black Caucus, he claimed, does believe in his sincerity because he does get to meet with them and look them in the eye. So, you know, you do get the sense that at least he gets what his problem is. And I think if he would spend more time once a month doing 45 minutes of this, or, you know, I do think it went about a half hour too long. You got the silly season questions in there from the news organizations. It probably shouldn't be credentialed, right? But hey, we're a free society. God bless them. But if he did that more, some of these disconnects, I think would soften the edges on some of the criticisms that are coming at him. Like the COVID explanation. Well, I think we all get it. Science changes. But you know what? That's only recently that they keep saying that. Why isn't the CDC doing daily briefings going, hey, we know science, which is why we brief you every day, right? If they just change their posture a little bit, they might soften the edges of the criticism. And I guess just generally, that's what you got. And then, of course, on the specifics, we do know, you know, he realizes he's going to do what he can. So here comes the deal making. Let's just hope it's not too late to deal make.
You bring up something interesting, Chuck, because I have to tell you, and you know, on this show, let's tell it like it is. Let's have some real talk. President Biden wants to get out of D.C. It's good for political journalists and people who cover the White House to get out of D.C. too, right? You're in Atlanta ahead of our midterm coverage, Chuck, talking to people in the suburbs, in the cities about what matters. What I think is important to talk about here, Carol, is, you know, when the president said he's going to break up Build Back Better into pieces. And that was significant news, Chuck, as you talked about on the special report right before we came on the air. That's a big deal because that was an open question. Now we know, and we know the things that he seems pessimistic will actually get done. Like, Carol, the child tax credit, right, which people care about. Now, is it exceptionally popular as people thought? No, not necessarily. Same thing with community college. There are other pieces, though, that affect folks, you know, where they live and in their homes. What does it functionally mean if this big piece of the president's agenda actually does get chopped up? Does it have a better chance to get done before the midterms, and how does it affect folks watching?
That's the question coming out of this, is how does he thread this needle now? If you get rid of the child tax credit and other provisions that the left of the Democratic Party really want, and we haven't seen, at least I haven't been able to look at my phone to see what some of the reaction is there, then who comes on board with to get the votes and get this over the finish line with the remaining pieces of this bill? I mean, the president wants a lot of climate. It's climate something that he and his advisors really want him to get done. They don't want to get rid of those pieces. So how he's now set the table and made the promises, and how he now works with the Congress that he has and the divisions within his own party to actually get this through, and what Republicans he can get on board, particularly when he says he doesn't want to be the legislator in chief anymore, is really an open question, and it'll be something that we'll be watching really closely because it matters. And I think one of the things that the president wants to do, if there's an overarching theme for year two, based on talking with White House officials, is he wants to do things that matter to people's lives, that they feel at home every day, that's changed them. And so he's got to deliver on that, and that's going to be very tough.
Chuck, as this is all going down, right, as the president was speaking from the White House, Senator Joe Manchin, you know what I mean, is speaking on Capitol Hill. I mean, talk about that kind of a split screen moment. And listen, it's important to note, for this voting rights package that the president wanted to get done, Republicans unanimously oppose it, right? They oppose the changes to these election reforms that Democrats want to see. Democrats agree those changes should happen. But without Republican support, Democrats have to change the rules, and therein lies the rub. That's what Senators Manchin and Sinema, these two Democrats, don't agree with. That's what this pinch point is, and that's why this voting rights bill package looks basically all but dead. But here's what's interesting, Chuck, and to link it back to this news conference we just watched, the president was asked a couple of times, and I wonder your take on this. Do you believe there will be free and fair elections in the midterms if this voting rights package doesn't get done? I mean, he set this in the highest stakes by essentially deflecting on that question, saying it is kind of an open question depending how this goes down in state legislatures. That is something else, right? When people look at their vote and what happens at the ballot that people care about.
Look, this is something that greatly concerns me over the next two election cycles. Is if the other side suddenly doesn't believe the election results they see, then you have two cycles in a row. It doesn't matter who we may say is factually correct or who isn't. Collectively, you'll have 80% of the country over a 4-year period suddenly calling into question the ability of us to count votes fairly, right? Like, that's the nightmare scenario here. So I think you're right to point out that hiccup there. He didn't know, he wasn't ready to say he'd accept the results, but he also wasn't ready to say that he thought the changes were going to make things unfair. He's basically almost like, let's wait and see. But, you know, I was going to make another point about voting rights. I do think there was some news by omission. You know, he didn't mention voting rights until he was asked about it. And that's okay. I mean, I think that he rightly is me. That's why I go back to saying he struck me as a guy who's been watching focus groups. The non-engaged sort of vast, like I said, that middle, that less engaged voter is more interested in the price of things and COVID protocols and their kids, and even supply chain. I mean, you know, I can't tell you the 3 voters I met today, they brought up the supply chain issues because they are getting it. In that sense, they're incredibly well informed about the issues that they care the most about. It's the stuff that's in front of them. So, look, I do think they've gotten that message, at least today they got that message, which is talk to voters about the issues that are in front of them. Yes, talk about voting rights and some of these other things, but right now, first and foremost, people are focused on COVID and the cost of goods and services right now. So get out ahead on those issues. So, look, I think breaking up Build Back Better, if he focuses on, hey, this is about saving you money on child care costs.
That's right.
I'm doing universal pre-K, child, you know, things like that. That's actually a lot easier to sell than whatever the heck's in Build Back Better, right? Because there's 25 things in that thing. If you actually narrow it down, it might be a better message during the campaign because it's specific.
Chuck Todd, Carol Lee, thank you so much for being with us on what has been, let's call it a rock and roll evening. Did we think President Biden was going to have a marathon, nearly 2-hour news conference? No, but here we are. Carol, Chuck, thanks to the both of you. I so appreciate it. I want to bring in somebody to focus on the foreign policy piece of what we heard from President Biden, and that's our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, joining us from Kiev in Ukraine. Richard, significant news also, right? We just sort of hit on the domestic piece of things from President Biden, but boy, did he make some news when it came to Russia. in what seemed to be a bit of a contradiction even within that 2-hour span, sort of seeming to say he thinks that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, might, in fact, take some kind of minor incursion. Then pressed on whether he was giving Putin permission, said, no, only Putin knows. How do you read this? I know it's too early to say how it's playing out in Ukraine, but talk me through how it's going on the ground there.
So there were several headlines, and I think the confusion you just talked about is one of the biggest ones. The whole world is watching how the United States is going to react to the Russian threat. There is a mission right here, right today, led by the Secretary of State, trying to project force, trying to tell Vladimir Putin that if he launches a military assault against this country of any kind, there's never been any kind of a distinction drawn between a small assault and a big assault, that Russia will pay consequences and that NATO is united and it will face sanctions like it has never sanctioned before. That has been the message that has been coming out of European capitals. That has been the message that was coming out of State Department officials, including the Secretary of State, up until just a few hours ago. And then we saw in this lengthy press conference, President Biden, apparently speaking from the heart, drawing a distinction between a big military invasion, an invasion that could arrive here in Kiev, potentially from Belarus. The Belarusian border is not very far from Kiev, and then he said that would have to come potentially later because the ground isn't frozen yet. And he said a major incursion, a major invasion, the kind of invasion we haven't seen since World War II, would cost Vladimir Putin dearly, could devastate his economy, and would unleash sanctions that Russia has never seen before or experienced before, and that perhaps Vladimir Putin doesn't even understand how significant they could be. But on a minor incursion, a military incursion, he said, well, that's something of a different story, whether there are questions about whether it's an incursion or not. And then he was pressed on it because several reporters in the audience, and I noticed it immediately, said, did he just give a green light to some sort of minor invasion, if something short of a full invasion, a potential incursion that could be deniable or in some way confusing or is limited in duration or scope? And even when pressed, he made a distinction about a big invasion or a small invasion, and he talked about how different NATO partners have different opinions on how to respond. Now, here in Ukraine, there is only one way that officials are going to be reading this, because there is only one place in this country where a small incursion that is some way ambiguous could be launched, and that is in the Far East. In the Far East, for about 8 years now, there are two enclaves, Donetsk and Luhansk, that are controlled by pro-Russian separatists. Russia already has undeclared troops in these separatist areas. They are not very far from Crimea, which Russia took over and formally annexed to Russian territory. And the question is, did Biden just give Vladimir Putin a green light to carry out some sort of operation in or around those separatist areas? And that is what Vladimir Putin has been banging on about. If you listen to what he's been talking about, aside from talking about NATO, he's also been talking about the separatist areas. He claims that the Ukrainians are treating the pro-Russian population, the Russian-speaking, because there's a difference between the Ukrainian language and the Russian language, the Russian-speaking population in the Far East. He says that they are discriminated against because of their pro-Russian stance, because of their language. And it is an enormously sensitive issue. Did President Biden just allow a bit of wiggle room and say, well, if you carry out an operation in limited size, sort of there, it might not trigger these sort of sanctions? So it is even if it's ambiguous, it's significant. And frankly, it didn't sound that ambiguous. Even when pressed, he made a distinction between a big and small operation.
Richard Engel, it's really great to have you live on the ground there and your perspective on all of this. We really appreciate you joining us. We'll watch for more of you on NBC Nightly News later. Thanks, Richard. So we talked about what's happening at the White House. Let's talk about what's happening up Pennsylvania Avenue on Capitol Hill, where right now, as we speak, we're live here, right? Democrats are fighting, let's face it, what is for them going to be almost certainly a losing battle in the Senate to get something done on voting rights. And just about maybe an hour from now, the Senate's going to try to move those bills forward. But again, Republicans aren't down with that. Democrats want to take matters into their own hands. They want to change the rules so that they can get this done without Republican support. But not everybody agrees on that. Two Democrats, in fact, disagree. And that's where the block is here, right? Senator Kyrsten Sinema, Senator Joe Manchin. Here's Senator Manchin not too long ago, actually, right as we were on the air, about why he opposes his party's plan to try to change the rules in their favor.
Allowing one party to exert complete control in the Senate with only a simple majority will only pour fuel on the fire of political whiplash and dysfunction that is tearing this nation apart, and you don't have to look very far to see how we're tearing ourselves apart. I can tell you, every part of this country, people are divided now.
I want to bring in Garrett Haake, our senior congressional correspondent. Garrett, help me understand something here, because I had a conversation with a Democratic senator earlier today who insisted to me that she believes they are still going to push forward on voting rights, even though it looks like by the time we wake up tomorrow morning, this voting rights package will be dead. If the definition of insanity is doing something again and again and having the same result repeatedly, what changes, right? How do Democrats get this done, considering President Biden, not 30 minutes ago, laid out what he sees are the very high stakes for making sure this happens?
Well, what changes is they may try to do individual pieces of what's in these broader, remember this is two bills smashed together, there's probably 30 different provisions all told between the two of them that are meant to strengthen and defend voting rights, ballot access, making election day a federal holiday. I mean, you name the provision. What you might see from Democrats is to try to take each of those individual provisions and bring them up for separate votes because they believe, A, the issue's important, B, the politics are good. All 50 Democrats support those individual provisions. And if they can keep reminding folks of that every day for the next 10 months, they think it's potentially a winning political issue as well.
Are you surprised by anything that you heard from President Biden on this in that news conference, given your perch and your view from the Hill, Garrett?
I was surprised that he seemed to endorse the idea of doing something small. He talked about possible changes to the Electoral Count Act. Yeah. That's something already under discussion with a bipartisan group of senators up here on Capitol Hill. I thought, while this debate is still going on here tonight, he would perhaps hold off from, killing this bill before it's officially dead. But no, he said, I think this is something we could do. He said he'd be willing to work with Republicans on it. It's not half a loaf. It's, the heel of the loaf of bread. But it's something on this issue.
It's maybe a slice, Garrett. Quickly on the Electoral Count Act, right? This is something that's interesting because there's a lot of discussion about what that means. I don't want to get into the whole history of it, but just to sort of shorthand for it, it's a 1800s era act, right? That essentially set the table for some of what we've seen and what some critics of it believe is ambiguity that related to the January 6th insurrection, right? You had scholars, academics, experts looking at what those loopholes are. But Garrett, here's my question. I've talked to voting rights experts who say you got to change the Electoral Count Act, right? You got to try to shore that up. Democrats weren't super interested in that 2 weeks ago. Do you think this makes a difference, President Biden tonight saying, hey, OK, let's go for the slice of bread versus the whole loaf?
I think what makes a difference is getting the door slammed on a bigger voting rights package. I mean, I think that's the reality. For Democrats, there was no reason to negotiate against themselves while they still thought that perhaps they could find a way to 50, maybe convince Manchin and Sinema to go for this rule change. But if that, if that show has left town, this is something. And perhaps you can start with those small changes to the Electoral Count Act and maybe build on to see what other changes you might get 10 Republicans to support. So, I think this is potentially the only game in town after tonight's votes.
Garrett, good point. A lot of good points coming from you tonight. Appreciate you joining us. Thank you. We got more breaking news from one of Garrett's colleagues on Capitol Hill because we just found out, again, as we've been on the air, told you this was a rock and roll night we're delivering, that the Supreme Court is saying it's not going to block the National Archives from releasing documents from former presidents' time in office. Those documents are going over to the House committee investigating the January 6th riot. That means at any minute, I think there was a 6 o'clock Eastern deadline. It's now 6:23 Eastern. Those records are going to get into the hands of lawmakers, even though former President Trump had been trying to prevent that. Legal fight after legal fight after legal fight. This has been a long time coming. We've talked about it on this show. The Justice Department told a federal appeals court those documents are not covered by this temporary injunction barring the release of a lot of other Trump-era records. So what does this mean? 4 pages from the Trump White House. That's what they're getting. We don't know what's on those 4 pages, but it's less about the quantity here than the fact that the committee is getting these documents at all. Leanne Caldwell, as promised, is on the Hill for us as well. 4 pages doesn't seem like a ton. It's not a ton, Leanne, and we don't even know what's on those 4 pages, right? But it is, at the very least for the Select Committee, a start.
Yeah, well, Hallie, there's 2 different issues here, and as you were speaking, we got a lot of clarity on what is happening here. So, if, yes, these 4 pages are going to be sent to the Select Committee, these 4 pages of documents that that were not involved in this court case that the former president was trying to block. So, meanwhile, while the archives is supposed to be releasing those 4 pages, the Supreme Court simultaneously also declined to interfere in the release of 700 pages of documents going to the January 6th committee. Our colleague Pete Williams reports that just one justice, Clarence Thomas, said that the court should have blocked the release of those documents. And so this is a big deal and a very bad night for the former president who tried to exert executive privilege on 700 pages of documents from his time in the White House that were in the National Archives. The Supreme Court just said that all of those pages can be handed over to the committee for their investigation.
This is shrouded in mystery in many ways, Leanne, because we don't actually know what's in those documents. When are we going to know? Will we know? Is it up to the Select Committee to tell us?
At this point, yes. These pages will not be released at this point. These pages are released to the committee, who said they have a legislative purpose for these documents. And perhaps we will see some of these documents in the form of a report when the committee does the report, or at the end of their investigation when they release more. But at this point, the public isn't going to see those documents, so we don't know what is in them, even though the committee says that they are crucial to their investigation.
Leanne, I'm going to ask you for just 10 seconds to put on your Pete Williams hat, which I know is an intimidating hat to wear, but because the Supreme Court has issued this ruling late tonight, developing as we're on the air, is this it? Is this the end of the road for Team Trump, which has done, thrown everything they can, appeal after appeal, to try to prevent this from happening? Do they have any more recourse?
I am not worthy of the Pete Williams hat, but I will do my best, and I think that this is the end of the road. Of course, this is the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, and they said that these documents can be turned over. Hallie.
Leanne Caldwell, live for us on the Hill. That is definitely a story I am sure we're going to be following more as it develops. Thank you so much, Leanne. Appreciate it. Speaking of former President Trump, his legal problems, not over, on a very separate front. That's because the New York Attorney General says her office has more than enough to accuse his organization of fraud. So why hasn't she actually filed any charges? Ken Delanian has that next. So the New York Attorney General says her office has uncovered, quote, significant evidence suggesting fraud in her ongoing investigation. It is a civil, not a criminal investigation, but her investigation of former President Trump and the Trump Organization. Here's the deal. In this court filing that's come out that's getting a ton of attention, Letitia James, the New York AG, says the former president and 2 of his kids, Ivanka and Donald Jr., were in charge of the company when misleading financial statements, right, were issued to lenders and the federal government. Today, you've got the Trump Organization trying to clap back. They say the only one misleading the public is Letitia James. They say she defrauded New Yorkers by basing her entire candidacy on a promise to get Donald Trump at all costs without having seen a shred of evidence and in violation of every conceivable ethical rule. Ken Delanian is following it all for us. Ken, it is not altogether surprising that Team Trump, the former president and his attorneys, would be coming out blasting the New York AG for what they describe as a partisan investigation. They've been saying that all along. What is interesting here is some of the revelations that are in this document now, this filing that feels a little bit like a preview of a case that she could potentially bring. Talk us through it.
Yeah, and you may be wondering, well, if there's evidence, why aren't there charges yet? And I guess the nuance is the evidence that suggests something is not quite the same as proof that it happened. What this looks like to me is that the AG has assembled a very strong case that Trump and his children and his company overstated the value of various properties to banks and insurance companies. For example, the filing says, I love this one, that he claimed that his apartment in Trump Tower was 30,000 square feet when in fact it was 10,000 square feet. That's black and white. That's indisputable, right? What I think they're trying to do with these subpoenas is get to the question of intent. Can they prove that Trump or his children knowingly lied? That's what they need to establish that these misstatements were fraud rather than a series of mistakes or errors. And for that, they need to try to talk to the people involved. Now, what's interesting here is that, as you said, there's a separate criminal investigation looking into many of the same issues. So it's very likely that even if the AG gets a judge to compel Trump and his children to testify, they'll take the Fifth Amendment. They'll decline to answer questions. But in a civil case, a jury is allowed to draw a negative inference from that. In other words, the jury could assume that Trump has something to hide if he refuses to answer questions. So that, in the end, may be the goal with these subpoenas, Hallie.
Talk to me about the kid factor here, because we are hearing in this information in this filing about Don Jr., about Ivanka. We know that they refused to comply with the Attorney General's subpoenas this month. We know Eric Trump, somebody else who is not mentioned, did comply in the fall. What is the deal with the Trump children, right? There's a lot of attention on them. What are the potential consequences? What's their next step?
Yeah, well, and Eric complied, but he took the Fifth hundreds of times, right? And it looks like Don Jr. and Ivanka are taking the position that they will only comply if a judge orders them to. And it seems logical that if that happened, they would also take the Fifth very often, given the potential criminal consequences. In a statement tonight, their lawyer attacked the investigation and said, in 160 pages of legal briefs, the Attorney General's office deliberately fails to address her repeated threats to target the Trump family and her assertions about her criminal investigation, all of which are the essence of our motion to quash the subpoenas or stay them. They make this argument here, Hallie, that basically, you can't compel us to testify in a civil case when we also have a criminal case where we have a right to remain silent, and you're participating in both of those things. And that may be a reasonable argument. We'll have to see what the courts do with that. You bring up something important that I think we have to talk about every time we talk about this civil investigation, because that is, of a different format, I guess. It's different than the criminal investigation, right? That's being done by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that we already know has resulted in criminal charges against its chief financial officer, et cetera. Can you talk about how what we're learning now in the civil case could play into the criminal investigation if it does? I think there's significant overlap, and what this shows is that there is ironclad evidence that the Trump organization said things that weren't true about their finances. The question for the criminal case is, can they prove that that was intentional, that that was a lie and not just a mistake? Because the defense in all these cases is, I just relied on my lawyers and my accountants. I didn't really do this on purpose. And that's why they need the testimony from these people, because, Trump notoriously never wrote anything down. So it's likely there aren't any emails where he said, I want to, overvalue these properties. And the other thing to remember, though, Hallie, is the standard of proof is much lower in a civil case. It's preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. So it'll be easier for Letitia James to get money damages than it will be for the DA to put these people in jail for this. Ken Delanian, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Coming up, we're just a couple weeks out. Can you believe it? A couple weeks from the Winter Olympics. It's coming up quick, and now China is apparently warning athletes, even from other countries, against speaking out about China. Can they even actually do that? More coming up in the 5 things. Plus, the White House set to give out hundreds of millions of free N95 masks next week. We've got Gotti Schwartz with more on the pandemic plans and whether you should really just catch Omicron and get it over with. Spoiler, don't do it. Manufacturers right now are scrambling to try to make good on the White House's promise of 1 billion free COVID tests for Americans. Jolene Kent has an inside look at how some companies are trying to ramp up production. That's an exclusive on us in just a second. But first, let's get you to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Just into us is number 1. 2 Marines killed today after a military vehicle rolled over in Jacksonville, North Carolina. The truck was carrying members of the 2nd Marine Logistics Group outside Camp Lejeune. 2 others were flown to a hospital nearby. We really don't have many details about what happened, but Marine officials are saying that the driver may have taken a fast turn and lost control. Number 2, a warning ahead of the Winter Olympics in Beijing coming from China's Olympics Organizing Committee. One member apparently said that foreign athletes, so athletes who are not Chinese from other countries, could be punished for saying things that violate Chinese law. It's coming at a time when there's a lot of concern about the restrictions that the country has put on free speech and expression. That's one we'll watch as the Olympics get closer. Number 3, the FAA today issued new approvals for 62% of the U.S. fleet to operate at airports with 5G.
This comes as some big international airlines canceled flights into the U.S. today over concerns about that 5G rollout. Remember, we talked about it all week on the show. Verizon and AT&T have now agreed to delay launching 5G near some airports. We still don't know how long that temporary pause will last. Number 4, what was supposed to be a controlled burn in Austin, Texas, instead became what you're looking at. See all that smoke? A 780-acre wildfire. That Rolling Pines fire is about 30% contained right now. Some 250 families had to evacuate. Number 5, President Biden today nominated a Muslim woman for a federal judgeship for the first time in U.S. history. Nusrat Chaudhry is currently the legal director of the ACLU of Illinois. If she's confirmed by the Senate, she'll not only be the first Muslim woman on the federal bench, but the first Bangladeshi American, too. So, free N95 masks, those really good masks that the CDC says you should wear. COVID tests, they're coming to everyone, or at least a lot of people in the country. That's part of the president's plan to fight the pandemic. You can get the test at covidtest.gov, but for the White House, they're working on a plan to give out 400 million of those N95 masks. The president says all you have to do is walk up to your local pharmacy or community health centers for some other masks that you'll get reimbursed for. All of this could start in early February, even though today the president admitted we should have had those tools maybe a little bit sooner.
Look, we're also increasing testing. Should we have done more testing earlier? Yes, but we're doing more now. We've gone from 0 at-home tests a year ago to 375 million tests on the market in just this month.
You also had today the CDC putting out some new findings, actually this afternoon, not too long ago, that shows people who got COVID actually seem to be better protected against Delta compared to people who got vaccinated. Now, that new report does not include Omicron, so we don't know what this means for people who are getting infected now, since Omicron is nearly 100% of new cases in this country. But since Omicron is so transmissible and by many reports milder than Delta, you've got some folks, you might have heard it in like your friend circle and your group chat from your family thinking, hey, should I maybe get COVID on purpose? Should I just get Omicron and get it over with since it's milder? This is not a good idea, folks. Gotti Schwartz is joining us because, Gotti, you've been reporting on this. You've been talking to doctors and they're saying, like, no, don't try to go get COVID right now.
Yeah, I've been reporting on it, and my phone is also filled with those text messages. And when you talk to doctors, they say this is a dangerous mindset, but it's also something that they understand and that they hear over and over again. This idea that if Omicron is so contagious but mild and everyone's going to catch it eventually, why not try to get it over with right now? And so right now, the only way they can really fight back against that is to have long conversations, and they usually start like this.
It's very unpredictable, and you may get lucky. You may have a very mild course, have no long-term effects, but as well, you may well end up in the hospital.
Now, Dr. Alejandra Casillas says another big gamble that is not being talked about enough is the danger of long COVID. People assuming that if they get it, it's going to be over in a few days. But what doctors are seeing is that a lot of young, healthy people are coming back after months and months and months. They're no longer contagious, but they're still suffering from a host of symptoms like fevers, fatigue, difficulty breathing. And that's not really being captured or reported on in the data that we see every day, because so much of it is about when you're contagious and when you're not. And then on top of that, obviously, you've got people that if they intentionally get COVID, the healthcare system is going to be even more strained. If somebody is lucky enough to get a mild case, then they could pass it to somebody else who ends up in the hospital or worse.
How effective are these points, right? Because, like, listen, you just mentioned it. You've got people texting you about this. I think we all talk to folks, and that kind of comes up sometimes. What are you hearing from people as you're sort of relaying these concerns that experts have about this mindset?
It's funny that we talk about this after we just watched a 2-hour-long press conference, but the problem with so much of this is that the devil is kind of in the details. And at this point, 2 years into the pandemic, most people just want simple, straightforward answers. And so yesterday I talked to this one guy. He told me his grandfather was unvaccinated. He died of COVID. How he thought maybe if his grandfather was vaccinated, he wouldn't have died. How his mom is in healthcare and double vax and boosted, takes all the precautions. She just came down with COVID, and he told me he was double vaccinated, but he wasn't sure if he was going to get boosted because he does not trust the messaging. So I asked him if he's scared of getting COVID, and here's his answer.
I've been doing what I've been doing and following, wearing my mask and stuff. I haven't gotten it, God forbid, but, I'm not licking telephone poles or anything like that to get it. But would I be scared to get it? Naturally. you know, but I don't want to be a hermit all my life and be in fear.
And as you can guess, doctors agree no one should be going around licking telephone poles, but there still seems to be that disconnect when it comes to getting everybody to trust the messaging. Hallie?
It's really interesting, Gotti, and that, again, is something that you're right. You just heard President Biden kind of address that, the idea of the messaging from the CDC and the science changing all the time. Gotti Schwartz, live for us in L.A. Thanks, pal. So in addition to this messaging question that the Biden administration is trying to answer, they're also trying to do things that will actually help. Get tools in your hands. Masks. We talked about those. Tests. That's really important. Have you tried to get online and order a test? You might have seen they're out of stock, especially with this Omicron surge. So now the Biden administration is saying, hey, we got $1 billion on the way. The question is, are companies actually able to make them? Is the government able to meet this new demand? The White House says yes, but one public health expert that our Jolene Kent spoke to says nearly 2 years into the pandemic, the numbers speak for themselves. Here she is.
The much-anticipated White House website for free rapid at-home COVID tests officially launched today.
How is the website working so far? Any problems, any issues?
We're very pleased with the website so far. It's gone through a whole series of tests, load testing and professionals working with it in the last week, and so far, so good.
Dr. Tom Inglesby is overseeing the national testing efforts for the Biden administration after the White House announced last year that 500 million tests will be sent nationwide, then doubling that number to 1 billion last week.
We have more than 200 million tests that are available in laboratories and point-of-care settings. We have school channels. We have channels for long-term care facilities to get more than 3 million free tests every week from the government. So we are bringing tests to the most vulnerable people.
But nearly 2 years into the pandemic, public health experts like epidemiologist Abigail Echohawk disagree with that assessment.
We've submitted orders from both to the federal government, to the state, to the county, and received about 100 tests at this point in time when we need at least 1,000.
Echohawk is the executive vice president of the Seattle Indian Health Board and a citizen of the Pawnee Nation.
How do you think the Biden administration has done so far?
We're seeing a lot of efforts to get home tests to folks and into agencies' hands. But however, despite all of the best efforts, we're still severely lacking in getting the number of tests that are needed, particularly for marginalized populations who are experiencing some of the worst impacts of COVID-19. And that has been the struggle throughout this pandemic, is we have not seen true equity actually happen. What we've seen is a lot of words and not as much action that has actually impacted those who need it the most.
What is your response to that?
We started in December a program to distribute 50 million free tests to community health centers and rural health clinics. We have dedicated programs for schools. We have dedicated programs for homeless shelters, for people living in carceral settings.
The free tests, 4 per household, the White House says will ship by mail 7 to 12 days after orders are placed on covidtest.gov. And so far, the only way to order is online, a challenge for people unable to access the internet and who lack a physical address, like many on Indian reservations and across rural America.
What are you doing to make sure that tests will be distributed in an equitable fashion, especially for people who don't have access to the internet?
Yes, we do know that a important portion of the country does not use the internet for one reason or another. It may be disability or by choice or lack of access, and we have full commitment to make sure that those people have the same opportunity to order these tests as those who do use the internet or have internet access. And so there will be a call-in line that is established for people to be able to call and order tests through that process.
When will we see that phone number?
It's coming soon.
Our thanks to our colleague Jolene Kent for that story. Coming up on the show, an incredible rescue caught on camera of a police officer in Texas saving a woman from a burning car. Look at that. More coming up on the local. Plus, a Tesla owner facing felony charges now over a deadly crash that involved the car's autopilot. Jake Ward has the latest on how the company's responding. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, some pretty dramatic body cam video coming out of San Antonio. Look at this. This is a cop rescuing a woman who was trapped inside a burning car that crashed. The officer says she thought it was going to explode, but that did not stop her from jumping right into action. Amazingly, the driver and the passenger both got out safely. Out of our Northeast Bureau, New York officials say one person is dead and 8 others are hurt after an explosion in the Bronx caused a building to partially collapse. It happened just 3 miles south of the apartment fire last week that killed 17 people. The cause of the explosion Tuesday, still under investigation. Also from our Northeast Bureau, the Boston Bruins paying tribute to an NHL pioneer. The hockey team retired Willie O'Ree's number 22 jersey. You know the 86-year-old has an impressive resume. He was the league's first black player in 1958. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame just a few years ago, but he says having his jersey retired is one of his life's greatest honors. For the first time, a driver who is using Tesla on autopilot is getting hit with felony charges for running a red light and causing a crash that killed 2 people. This happened in 2019, but now LA's district attorney is charging this driver with vehicular manslaughter. The driver's pleading not guilty, but let's talk about why this is a big deal. And it's because autopilot, its use, its misuse, has been the subject of a bunch of investigation by the feds. These felony charges are the first involving this kind of technology used by a lot of drivers. And it could mean a big reality check for people who like these systems. Jake Ward has more.
Hallie, since it first became technologically feasible that we would someday be driving around in cars that were in fact driving themselves, there's been one huge question on the minds of both the people building the cars and lawyers and regulators who look at the ethical and legal implications of such an idea. Here's the question. Who is at fault when a robot car crashes? Now, up until now, we have assumed that anything above a certain level of real autopilot was going to fall on the companies, and that was the fundamental idea. If anything, the statistics seem to suggest that self-driving cars are, in the long term, going to be safer than having humans at the wheel because we get sleepy, we get drunk, we get distracted, and robots won't do that. But we are in a phase right now where those autopilot systems are not, in fact, reliable and, in some cases, are not yet legally supposed to be used to let the car drive themselves. So this particular case is a really interesting milestone. So on December 29th, 2019, a 2016 Model S, a Tesla, came off a freeway, went through a red light on autopilot, and killed 2 people in a Honda Civic sitting there at the intersection. Now, LA County has brought felony charges not against Tesla, but against the driver. And those felony charges, experts say, may be a very first time that we have ever seen a driver held responsible for handing over responsibility to an autopilot system. Now, the charging documents don't actually mention autopilot, but if it in fact is the case that this driver is found guilty of negligent, of manslaughter in this case, it's going to be a huge wake-up call for the vehicle manufacturers who hope to eventually turn over the act of driving to the car itself. The whole legal regime around it has been built on the idea that it would be up to the companies to take responsibility when this were to happen. In this case, it turns out that is not going to be the case. This driver is actually being brought up on these charges, a 27-year-old, on the idea that he handed over the system. So, again, a huge milestone and one that could really determine the future of self-driving cars, Hallie.
Our thanks to Jake Ward for that. We've got some more breaking news out of the Hill for you, as if what we've seen tonight wasn't enough. We've now learned that the House committee looking into January 6th is issuing more subpoenas again tonight against Nicholas Fuentes and Patrick Casey. You may not have heard of them, but they're leaders of America First or Groyper movements. The committee says both of them were involved in events before January 6th, promoting unsupported claims about the 2020 election. Let's call them what they are. They were lies about the 2020 election, and they were on the Capitol grounds that day. Lawmakers are also looking at public reports citing both Fuentes and Casey, saying they received tens of thousands of dollars in crypto and Bitcoin from a French computer programmer, money the FBI has been looking into to see whether or not they were linked to the Capitol attacks. Now, we want to bring you today's original, in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And you know inflation is in the spotlight. And against that backdrop, you've got thousands of Kroger's grocery workers in an ongoing strike against the company. Why? Their paychecks aren't going as far as they used to. The union representing these workers released a survey that found 3/4 of them reported they are food insecure. Like, just take a beat on that, right? They work at a grocery store to feed people, but cannot feed themselves or find it hard to feed themselves. Remember, inflation's the highest it's been since the 80s. So Maura Barrett hit up Colorado for us to meet with some folks on the picket line.
Like a show of hands, can you guys show me how many people feel comfortable with what they're paid each week? Do you feel like you're living a comfortable life? Anybody raising their hands? No one.
One of the reasons you're not getting any hands raised here is that we're watching our competition. We do feel shortchanged and we feel taken advantage of.
This is day 8. More than 8,000 workers striking across Colorado at Kroger-owned King Superstores. Each of them with their own struggle trying to make ends meet.
We're asking you to not cross our picket line and shop at Walmart or Safeway.
Like Liz Wesley, a floral manager for almost 2 decades. She says her pay has increased only $4.50 an hour in 17 years.
Some of our employees are sharing 3-4 people to afford their housing. Some of them are living in their cars. Some of them are homeless. If you're working 40 hours a week, you should be able to make at least enough to support, yourself and put food on your table.
These workers asking Kroger for a pay increase, better benefits, and stricter safety measures after working through the pandemic. Barbara Hunter works in the meat department and says paying her bills each week is tough.
You rely on having a double income in your house.
We have to have a double income. I have a triple income. My daughter helps out too. She's 19 and she makes more than me. She makes $16 an hour working at her store for only 6 months.
Kroger paid their workers hazard pay at the start of the pandemic, an extra $2 an hour. That ended after 2 months. Then workers saw their CEO collect a $22.4 million pay package in 2020, according to the company's regulatory filings.
There's no reason why these multi-billion-dollar companies should be taking advantage of the people that are making those profits for them.
Now, the union releasing a survey of 10,000 Kroger workers across Colorado, Washington, and California, detailing that 3/4 of workers say they are food insecure, while nearly half say they live in inadequate housing. Kroger calls that report misleading, their own research pointing out the company on average pays hourly workers more than its peers. Negotiations are still ongoing, the union rejecting the company's offer for a starting salary at $16 an hour, just 13 cents more than Denver's minimum wage. Labor experts say the current economy is partially to blame, combined with technological developments.
What does it say about American labor in general right now that whether you're unskilled or you're trained, people don't feel like they're making livable wages?
There's a problem with inflation eating away at the purchasing power of American workers. When you have that, you're going to have a lot of unhappiness among workers. They're going to be working. They have no choice but to work.
And companies just aren't keeping up?
They're slow to keep up. I have a saying when I talk to audiences that if employers act like pigs, prepare to be slaughtered. In other words, you have to think ahead.
What time is it?
Well into their 8th day of talks, workers still fighting.
What keeps you working here?
The community. This is the best community that I can ever see. We have such a loving family. This is my family, my second family. Hey, family! We love each other. We all support each other. We have an issue, we work it out.
The work family, I think a concept familiar to a lot of people. Maura Barrett is joining us live now. So Maura, the negotiations between these two sides didn't seem to get anywhere overnight or didn't seem to make a ton of progress at this point. And now you've got Kroger, which is looking to, stop these picketers, no?
Right, Hallie, overnight they reached a stalemate. I just heard from a union official. They again left the negotiation table today with nothing, no compromise. And now what we saw today is Kroger actually issuing a temporary restraining order against these workers that have been on the picket lines, limiting them to about 10 workers per store. And obviously you could see there in the stores we visited earlier this week, there were a lot more people there. Kroger, though, I want you to read some of the statement that they sent to me, saying that at several locations, picketers are engaging in unlawful activity, including threatening, blocking, and intimidating both associates and customers who have chosen to cross the picket line. They say these activities are not peaceful and, frankly, are unsafe. Now, we visited several stores in Colorado, but there are obviously dozens across the entire state. I will say the workers were politely asking customers to go shop somewhere else and support them. They told me the community has been incredibly supportive, and they're only coming to these stores if other options are out of stock, which is something that we did see at competing grocery stores because the community has been so supportive of these workers and their intention. Hallie.
Maura Barrett, thank you for taking that trip out to Colorado to do some of that reporting on the ground for us. We really appreciate you. doing that for the show. That does it for us this hour. We told you it was going to be rock and roll. It sure was. We'll see what tomorrow brings. We'll see you here same time, same place. Top story with Tom Yamas starts right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.